I have to actually tip my hat to Isela and Jim, who are the real experts in transit and transportation. And, you know, there were some code words, I think, in what Isela was saying, but if you could read through them, there's a message to our policymakers as well in terms of priorities. Let me talk a little bit about two things. Is the shape of the future of transit going to be in South Florida? What should it be? And how's it going to be paid for? I think there are two things we have to really focus on. And Isela was getting to this in her comments as well, maybe not as bluntly as I might. But the fact of the matter is the most productive, efficient use of new transit systems will be in the most dense urbanized areas. So you have Miami, Fort Lauderdale, West Palm Beach. You have had a significant growth in populations in those areas. You have Miami Beach, South Beach, which is a huge activity center as well. Clearly, serving those areas with premium transit will benefit a significant portion of the population in the region. Not everybody. There are still and always will be people who live in far out suburbs who will not be able to be served by good transit. And we should not be designing systems and paying and funding for systems to pick up small pockets of people far out from the urban core. But I can see, and Fort Lauderdale is doing it now as well, where the main urban centers have effective transit systems which connect to the regional spine, which is today Tri-Rail, but in the future may be the FEC corridor. And so the key is going to be, I think, the fine-grained local transit systems which connect to the larger regional transit system, which is the spine. And that will also get into sort of where federal dollars and state dollars, if there are any, should go, I think, in terms of funding transit improvements. Because if you take, for instance, high-speed rail, and I've always been an advocate and fan of rail, but the use of $2.5 billion federal dollars for a high-speed rail link between Tampa and Orlando, in terms of the benefits to the number of people who would be riders and therefore the environment and the ecology and everything that was on that list we saw before, dwarfed by if you spent that money supporting local transit and regional transit. That's where the riders are. That's where the support needs to be. So I think and I hope that as we go forward in future years, that's going to be where the bulk of transit dollars are spent. That Bay Link, which would circulate Miami Beach and connect to downtown, happens. That would be a hugely successful system. That was, you might remember, it was approved when I was mayor and has languished ever since then. But down here, downtown Miami has, although it's rudimentary by sort of national standards, has one of the best local transit systems, the Metro Mover. Thousands of people use Metro Mover. People live downtown now and don't take their cars to work or don't take their cars to go from an office building to government center because you have Metro Mover. And there's a talk now at the county about expanding Metro Mover, closing the Brickell Loop to bring in all that population there, perhaps expanding further north, going towards the design district in Midtown. And so you could, with a relatively small amount of dollars, connect a tremendous population where people live, where people work, where the activity centers are, including the public facilities like the arena and the Performing Arts Center and major regional shopping centers like Midtown and soon Brickell City Center and others. So I think that that's what a lot of the future should be. And then, of course, you need regional commuter rail because a lot of people work across county lines. And I think if it's convenient, there's someone who works in our group in my firm who lives in Boynton Beach, takes Tri-Rail to the office in Miami every day. I think there would be a lot more people like him if the system was more convenient to where people live. Now, another side of that equation is how is it going to be paid for? And that is, of course, the $64,000 question. We are in an era now, and it's probably going to continue for the foreseeable future, where government support is going to be limited. And so as a result, that creates certain problems. But it also points the way towards how some of the transit improvements can be done in the future. First and foremost among those, I think it's a paradigm-shifting model nationally, is All Aboard Florida, is privately owned, operated, and funded intercity rail service between Miami, Fort Lauderdale, West Palm, and Orlando. And I think that's a model for the future, at least for some elements of transit service. And it not only has the benefit of needing less government support or dollars, maybe a little land or something, you know, right of way, but it also has the benefits of the efficiency and the promptness and timeliness of the private sector doing a project. The private sector just is able to do projects better, quicker, faster. And so that's going to be a piece of it, I think, on an increasing basis. However, when you go to the local level, and I really defer to Isela and Jim, there's always going to have to be, I imagine, some element of subsidy for a local transit system, if it's the streetcar, if it's the Metro Mover, if it's Metro Rail, perhaps even if it's regional commuter rail. And that's sort of where I think the government dollars will have to come in to support, to create these systems, and as Isela says, to operate these systems on an ongoing basis. But I think that the future, we can kind of see that if you're in downtown Miami, you can kind of see what the future could be for not all, but a significant chunk of South Florida. Because there are thousands and thousands of people living here today, within a few blocks of where we are, who have one car for a couple or no cars, who walk or use public transit to get to work. By the way, there's a huge population in South Beach that does the same as well, which shows you with density, jobs near residential, commercial to support residential life, and activity centers, you don't need a lot of transit in order to make that work really well. So what's happening here in and around downtown is really the future, I think, of transit in South Florida, then connecting to the regional spine.
If any of you ever moderate a panel, don't ever give them all the questions in advance, because they'll try to answer them all in their first one. But we're seeing some very passionate folks with some very passionate visions here. But you all have mentioned funding. I'd like for you really to delve into that just a little bit more, because that is the key to building any of this. And Neeson, you've almost convinced me to leave my suburban house. We know these solutions are costly, and new taxes are not viewed as viable options by many in the voting public. But then there's others who say a really strong case hasn't been made for that yet. So how do we fund these needs? How do we move the needle on getting more support? All of you work in this area. What should we be doing to move that needle of support, and how should we fund these projects?
Well, I stole Isela's mic, so I'll have to tackle this one first. How do we get the public support? That's a lot about what the 750 is about. Coming to a consensus on our vision and what it takes to accomplish that vision. In 2006, Broward County had a referendum for a penny sales tax for transit. And as I recall, it went down about 60-40. Did not pass. And in fact, that's a very common experience around the country, that the first time there's a referendum for transit, it goes down. And the case has to be made, and people have to believe that it's something worth investing in. And it didn't happen in Broward in 06. Miami-Dade has half a cent. It was painful to get the half a cent, but people went out there, made the case, and they're fortunate to have that. Very challenging to get the operating money. Isela already addressed that briefly, and with a little bit of frustration, it sounded to me that the formula is local operating. And that's what we hear from the federal government. That's what we hear from the state. That, in fact, is a norm nationally. If you see cities that, like Portland or Dallas, that have transit, they have found a dedicated local revenue source to pay the operating cost. A typical formula for a premium transit project, and that's code for it could be a train, a trolley, something more than normal local bus service. It could be express bus. It doesn't have to be a train. But premium transit, the typical formula is that the capital cost, the cost of constructing it, building stations, buying buses or trains or whatever the hardware is, the capital cost is frequently 50% federal, 25% state, and 25% local. Local is frequently county, it could be city, but some sort of local, 50, 25, 25. And then the operating cost is typically 100%. And as Isela says, you know, it starts out smaller than the capital, but it never stops. It goes on forever, and it adds up to being frequently more than the capital cost. Now, that's a typical formula. And a success story is the Wave in downtown Fort Lauderdale, which will be under construction, it'll be operating, I hope, in 2016. The key to getting that done was the Broward County Commission committed to the operating funds. And because that happened, the rest of the money came from the state, came from the federal government, and the Wave is going to be constructed. The hardest nut is the operating subsidy. And I kind of hope that the 750 process here, we recognize as our participants in that the vital importance of building a plan that includes premium transit and figuring out how we're going to sell that to the community at large and how we're going to fund it.
Mason, why don't you go next?
Okay, it's a complex issue, but I think there are two aspects to it. And yes, it does deal with public confidence in the transit system and the willingness to fund it at the local level and fund operating costs, as Jim has mentioned. But it's a little bit of it's a two-sided coin. Isela inherited a tough situation, which has been made a lot better. But when you look at the tax that was the transit tax that was passed, and the things that the money was originally spent on, that have now since then had to be corrected, extension of creation of new bus routes, extension of bus routes, hiring more bus drivers, there was money raised by the tax, but it wasn't spent for the transit improvements that people thought they were voting for. So there's an element of that when transit dollars are spent, they have to be spent for efficient things that have great public benefit. Even on a more local level, this may be politically incorrect to say, but the City of Miami, in part using its People's Transportation Tax money, is funding a trolley system, the faux trolley, the rubber tire trolley like Coral Gables has. But due to the politics, each one of the 5 commission districts needs to have a system. And that system is going to cost money to operate. And as a result of each 5 districts having to have a system, the headway time is limited because there are just so many trolley buses that you can have. So downtown, for instance, which is without question where the demand is greatest. It's linear, it's dense, it has residential, it has activity centers, it has offices. You have a 15-minute headway time because there aren't enough trolleys to adequately service the system up and down Biscayne Boulevard and Brickell Avenue principally. Until decisions on things such as routes are not made based on politics, we're going to continue to confront this problem of public's lack of confidence. And then it affects ridership and usage. I use Metromover, for instance, all the time. Why do I use it? Because I know if I miss one train, 2 minutes later, another train's going to be there and I get where I need to go. So part of that is governments need to, not only will they need to raise money in the way of, and probably through taxes, but also need to rejigger the spending so that the money that's there is spent where it's needed and spent more effectively. The other element of that is, I think, cannot underestimate the private sector's role. P3 projects as well as the mechanism for building important infrastructure, including transit, and operating it as well. At least in that scenario, the government's liability is capped. And therefore there usually has to be some government investment, but it's defined, it's capped, and the risk then shifts over to the private sector.
Gisela.